All right, there we go. So there's an actual tag in the SuperPOM called the lifecycle tag, and in there is a description for each one of the lifecycle phases, and each phase has its own definition in terms of lifecycle subphases. It's kind of one way to think about it. But those subphases always are executed or handled by some plugin goal. So whenever we invoke a lifecycle command, realize that Maven is going to do an internal lookup to see what plugins need to be executed, which goals with those plugins need to be executed, and the order in which they're executed. So that's a slight review there. There are three more lifecycle commands that we need to be aware of: clean, cite, and then default. Clean does as you would expect. The clean lifecycle is used to clean up what I would call build crumbs or any artifacts that you don't want laying around before you do a build. Easy way to do a clean, Maven space clean. You'll notice that it's going to go through 3 different phases. It's going to do a pre-clean, clean, and then a post-clean. Deletion of the actual artifacts is in that clean phase. Okay, so you may be asking yourself, what is a post-clean or what is a pre-clean? It depends on how I've configured it. But generally, if you think about validating whether a directory exists or removing a directory after I've removed the files, things like that could be in the post-clean or the pre-clean. Simple execution. Output is as would be expected. I invoke the lifecycle command. Since our project is very simplistic, all that it's going to do is remove the target directory and everything in the target directory. So clean doesn't really justify a lot of explanation. Hopefully, it doesn't really justify a lot of explanation. There is a clean plugin. There's a clean plugin that has a clean goal. If you wanted to dig into those details more, you could. You want to just go ahead and quick type Maven clean and see what happens on your end? Okay, pretty straightforward, right? Okay, so let's move to the next one then. Another lifecycle command is the cite lifecycle, or cite lifecycle phase, however you want to say it. The idea here is that as good Java developers, we always document our code with JavaDoc, right? And instead of me learning how to use the JavaDoc command, and instead of me, warring up or archiving the HTML that's generated from the JavaDocs and pushing them to a web server, I can use this cite lifecycle to do everything on my behalf. The cool thing about the cite lifecycle is that it will also incorporate testing reports, so I can see, through a web browser how effective my tests were, so on and so forth. So it's pretty nice. It is not a continuous. It's not a continuous thing, and what I mean by that is when I run the cite lifecycle, it's basically just doing a snapshot of that particular point in time. And then if I want to regenerate documentation, I'm going to have to do the cite lifecycle, again as my project evolves. So it's just snapshotting, in other words. The cite lifecycle is defined by 4 different phases. We're probably only worried about 2. The cite phase, which actually generates the HTML documentation, and the deploy, which deploys the site. So if I wanted to create a website from my project, I would type Maven site. You can see all of the different pieces that it's going to create on my behalf. About 10 different things. And now if I were to look at the project directory structure, I would see in my project directory structure a new folder created called site. And in that new folder, I would see all of the different HTML files, CSS files, so on and so forth, that are created on behalf of my project. And then, of course, just having that HTML is kind of pointless unless I deploy it somewhere. So I obviously can go navigate the file system to pull up the documentation and see what's created. So you can see here, all the different things that are going on. Who's on my team, for example. If I have some information about the project built into my POM, that would show up there, so on and so forth. If I want to have the site quote unquote run in a browser, meaning I'm going to deploy it to a web server, I can just use this Maven site :run goal. So I run the run goal associated with the site plugin, and that's going to start up Jetty for me, deploy the site to Jetty, and then I can access it using my local host. So let's go ahead and try. Why don't you guys go ahead and try that as well, and run the site command, and then run the Maven site run goal. And then once the site's deployed to your web server, just poke around in it for a minute and just see if you can correlate the information that's generated to the pom.xml file that we have in our project. And then yell at me once you feel like you've explored that enough.
I think you can specify a different port to run Jetty.
So what if I want to run this on a different port?
Yeah, so you can obviously configure the Jetty plugin.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's a little in the PDF. I want to say it's maybe around like page 160 or something like that. It talks about how to configure Jetty and Tomcat. So you could do this, configure this to use Tomcat too if you wanted.
Okay. All right, good. Okay, so we have that.
Okay, and were you guys able to see how some of the POM configuration information affects the site? Like if you go to, a real simple way is go look at project team, it should be empty.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So the point there is that some of the stuff that the site plugin reports on, right now we have not baked into our POM. So the easy
Right.
the easy solution to that is, just start making our POM more comprehensive and
Yeah.
more.
There's very little information in here, but
Right. Exactly.
we get the idea.
Yep. So I mean, at least the good thing is that at least it does structure things correctly, but it's not as intelligent as maybe some of the other things in Maven, but that's okay. It's more reliant on the information that we provided. So are we good with that?
Yep.
Okay, cool. So the next life cycle is the default life cycle, and just like an ant, maybe I don't want to type ant compile or ant test, or in this case, maybe I don't want to compile, or maybe I don't want to type Maven compile or Maven test or whatever. I can create or I can define what the default lifecycle phase that's executed on my behalf when I just type Maven. So if I wanted to, I could go into my pom.xml file and insert an element that defines, what I want my default to be. It's not a big deal to do that, but just be aware of its existence. In the default build lifecycle, if I really wanted to understand how Maven is going to walk through, or all this, I guess, slight delay in my slide here. Let's try this one more time. All right. So if I was interested in knowing all the different phases that are going to occur in the default lifecycle, and you'll notice that the default lifecycle definition right now is kind of soup to nuts. I could go open up my SuperPOM, check it out, see what's defined. So from a packaging perspective, when I am working with jars, there are a couple of other life cycles that I need to be aware of. So we've gone through, let's see, create as a plugin, goal, execution, compile, test, package. We've looked at clean, and we've looked at site. So there are two other life cycles that we need to be aware of when we're working with a jar. So these may or may not exist, or these may or may not make sense for every single archetype that I'm working with. For example, install probably doesn't make sense in the context of a war, but maybe it does. It depends on my project. So let's talk about the two for a minute. Install is a way for me to take my jar that is created as a result of a package element and install it in my local repository. So that means, once I've done that, that means any other project that I'm working on can reference my project as a dependency, as long as I'm on the same machine and a single user on the same machine sharing the home directory. Okay, so it's quite common. It's quite common in the world of development, right, where I create a project that is a composition of smaller projects. So I create a project that's a composition of multiple jar libraries, so to speak. So what I would do is I would package each one of those smaller jar libraries. I would then install them in my local directory, my local repository, so that my compositional project could access them. And then Maven will handle all the dependencies as we expect. Deploy is much like install, Deploy is actually taking my jar and deploying it to a remote, quote-unquote, remote repository. So if my organization sets up our own central repository, which augments the primary central repository, instead of me installing my jar on my own physical local machine in my own M2 directory, I could deploy it to our internal private repository. And then the way that Maven's going to look for my dependencies is that it's going to look to my local repository. If it doesn't find it in my local repository, it's going to look at my internal central repository. If it doesn't find it there, then it's going to go to the main central repository. So those are two other, the point there is that there are two other lifecycle phases that deal with deployment and installation of my packaging element into the Maven repository. So the key thing to recognize for those of us in the Java world that are coming to Maven from maybe a web development background or EE background, key thing to recognize here is that deploy does not actually deploy to my web server or application server. Questions on that? Okay, so I'm going to try to give you some insight to a couple of other sub phases in this default phase, just so you're aware that they exist. First one here is the process resources phase. The process resources phase basically allows the compiler to do pre-processing or post-processing on related resources. So, for example, if I want to have like a log4j.properties file configured as part of the build process, and I want it configured one way for my local test development, one way for my my remote test development, and one way for production, I could use this process resources phase to do the appropriate resource filtering and inclusion of a log4j configuration. Okay, so that automatically is executed. Whether or not it does anything depends on whether or not my POM actually has a resources directory with files in it. Okay, filtering, again, whether or not filtering works, it really depends on whether or not I turn it off or on. So I've got process resources for both compile. I've got compile and test. My process resources for either one or both. Compile phase, we know about this. The reason that we're talking about it again is that the compiler by default is configured to support an older version of Java and an older version of the Java source and an older version of the Java target. So if you're not familiar with those two flags with the compiler, there is a way for me to cross-compile or down-compile my source code to the appropriate target platform. So I could take a source tree that was written for 1.3, and the production environment is still 1.3, but on my development machine I only have 1.6. I've made an enhancement to the source tree, and now I need to down-compile it. I don't want to go out and find JDK 1.3 to do that. I just tell the compiler, hey, use version 1.3 for my source and my target, as an example. Okay, so Maven right now by default, I haven't checked it at the latest. I haven't grabbed the latest version of Maven to check if this is still true, but by default, Maven, last time I checked it, was 2 releases behind standard release in terms of its compilation for both the source and the target. So more than likely, you'll definitely want to configure the compiler so that you can use Java 5, annotations and cool things like that. If I wanted to invoke the compiler directly, you can see I can just use the compiler plugin along with the compile goal, and that will function as if I am invoking the compile lifecycle phase. thing to recognize is that it functions as if I am invoking the lifecycle phase, but it's not actually invoking the lifecycle phase. So process resources is part of the lifecycle phase for compile. When I invoke the compiler :compile command, the whole process resources piece doesn't get executed. So I am, in other words, I am bypassing all of the precursor elements in that phase and invoking the specific task, if you will. So just be aware of that. In addition, I mentioned this earlier, I can do this this process test resources, same type of thing. I can have different configuration files or different property files for a test environment versus a production environment. So that's going to happen before the test phase actually occurs. So one thing that's a little bit interesting to me is that if I can, just general Kelby opinion, if I configure the compiler to use a new source and target options, I also have to configure the compiler for my test phase. So you would think that if I can configure the compiler once, I configure the compiler for all different phases, but that's not the case. So if I do go and modify the source and the target options for my production, I'm going to want to make sure that I do the same thing for my test. Otherwise, I could have production code generated to a different version level than my test code, or vice versa. So at some level, I have invalidated my test. So we've already talked about the test phase. The point here is that, like anything, I can bypass the entire lifecycle phase and just invoke the actual plugin's goal. So if I wanted to just physically test a test without going through all the different, pre-process test resources, post-process test resources types of phases, I can just do surefire :test. You'll notice you can use testng if you wanted to. You'll notice that it's going to use a naming convention to find tests. The one thing that may or may not be good is that the default configuration for the test plugin is to stop testing on the first failure of a test. So you may want to, for example, either specify a flag when I invoke the plugin to skip failed tests, meaning to continue on the processing, or you may want to configure that directly in the POM. So here's basic output if I wanted to, again, bypass the entire test lifecycle and just invoke the test directly. Maven space surefire :test, and move on with life. So we've talked about the package. We've talked about the package phase. The package lifecycle phase is dependent upon the package plugin. We've already gone through and discussed how the package plugin doesn't really create my own standalone complete jar. It just builds a jar as a library. If I wanted to bypass the entire lifecycle packaging and just package something directly, again, I could use the plugin with the goal jar. Not to make a reference to a character in a Star Wars movie. That was supposedly a joke, but not a very funny one. You got it. All right. Good. So the install phase, we talked about that. Point there is that if I want to bypass the entire install phase, I can use the install plugin. And the same thing is true with the deploy phase. I can bypass the entire phase and just use the deploy plugin if I wanted to. Okay. So in summary, the point of showing you about the point of talking about the phases and how they map to plugins is that there may be certain cases in your development where you need to debug a particular thing, and you'll want to directly control the plugin instead of using the entire lifecycle. So it may sound like a very abstract point. A very practical point is that if I'm using resource inclusion and resource filtering, I may want to just test the resource filtering functionality without having to go through the entire compile lifecycle phase. Right? So, if I've got 10,000 Java files in my source tree, and I don't want to waste the time of trying to compile every single one of those just to prove to myself that resource filtering is working, there's an example of where I would bypass the entire lifecycle phase. That make sense?
Yes.
Okay, good. So just for the just for the sake of argument, why don't you go ahead and try the Maven install. I'm going to put my phone on mute for just a moment. I'm going to grab some water. My voice is getting a little bit harsh, and then we'll talk about some customizations.
Thank you. Please stand by.